this brings us to the last section of our presentation. So, and this is kind of about if the goal of the economics is to enhance well-being, as we discussed in our chapter 1, then we need to ask whether current level of consumerism is actually compatible with the idea of well-being, and if not, then what should be done about it. And there's some research which specifically looks at links between consumption and well-being. That's what I'm going to talk about next. So one question that arises when one thinks about connections between consumption and well-being is a very important and famous question which everyone asks at some point in their life, I think. So does money buy happiness? And what we can do to find if money does buy happiness or not. So economists have found one measure that captures this dilemma, money versus happiness, and it is a measure of welfare based on survey questions asking people about their own degree of life satisfaction. And collecting data on this measure of subjective well-being involves surveying individuals and asking them questions such as, all things considered, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole on these days, and respondents then answer based on some kind of scale ranging from 1 to 10, 1 being dissatisfied, 10 being almost always satisfied. So this kind of surveys have been going on, and economists have used this kind of survey to measure to this connection between money and happiness. And what they find is one of the surveys that uh, had that surveyed 4 lakh people in United States found that higher income does tend to be associated with higher subjective well-being, but at a decreasing rate. So this finding is quite consistent with the concept of diminishing marginal utility that we saw in part 1, which essentially says that additional income does increase utility, but each additional dollar tends to result in smaller utility gain. And this is also consistent with the idea that people evaluate themselves relative to others, right? So this is one research. In another research, that other researchers have found that people who hold materialistic values tend to be less happy with their friends and families, have less fun, are more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol, and to display anti-social symptoms such as paranoia and narcissism. So people with materialistic values generally also have more physical symptoms and are likely to engage in addictive behavior and develop anti-social behavior. So these are all the findings which simply say that money does buy you happiness, but not so much. It can buy you happiness up to a point as per the research, but after that point, money doesn't really buy you happiness. You need other things like maybe time for meeting with your friends and family. So if we are trying to see between money and happiness, we have to also to see the balance between money and time. So this problem that we talked about in the last slide about finding that balance between money and time is a very important problem, and this has exacerbated in recent years because nearly everyone feels a constant pressure to compete with others in terms of money, in terms of conspicuous consumption, in terms of keeping up with the Joneses, and now keeping up with the Kardashians. So all this leads to negative consequences for society in general, with people having less time for relaxation, for families, for friends and other pursuit. In fact, um, one book and several TV shows have given this name spin to this problem, and they call it affluenza, deriving from the word influenza, as a disease with symptoms of overload, debt, anxiety, and waste resulting from dogged pursuit of more. And some people see the solution of affluenza as rejecting consumerism as the primary goal in life. So this has resulted in another term called voluntary simplicity, which refers to a conscious decision to live with a limited or reduced level of consumption in order to increase one's quality of life. And motivation for such voluntary simplicity vary from environmental concerns to desire to have a more free time to travel, to raise a family, to focus on other non-consumer pursuits and goals. This kind of brings us to the end of the discussion about consumption. And one thing is that we saw that there are many problems involved with consumption, or at least unregulated consumption, and it is unrealistic to expect that majority of people in developed countries will just adhere to all these things like voluntary simplicity. If we accept that overconsumption is problematic for reasons as we discussed in this chapter, due to ecological impact of such overconsumption, social impact and personal well-being, then we must consider whether public policies is needed to curb some kind of excessive consumerism. And that might sound problematic because government regulation in something as personal as consumption might sound very problematic, but the fact of matter is that the current regulations do influence your consumer decisions. If you think about alcohol and tobacco consumption and the rules and regulations around that consumption, you will understand that we are already in a public policy regime when we think about consumption. So, and as we saw in chapter 7, that regulation need not be about rules and strict government interventions, but rather they can be in the form of nudges which are aimed at behavioral changes. So one policy change that a book suggests could be to indirectly reduce consumerism is to provide workers with greater flexibility in setting work hours with proportional reduction in wages and benefits. And as has been seen in many experiments, many workers may choose shorter work hours and thus less pay in favor of more time for non-work pursuits. Another policy that would be good to increase to decrease consumption is to increase regulation on advertising, and European countries do have such kind of regulations, and they have really strict regulations on advertising, especially aimed towards younger children. So this is something that can be thought of in the US context as well. And a final suggestion that books gives us is to reduce consumerism would be to shift from income taxation towards progressive consumption taxation as proposed by Robert Frank, with a high progressive tax at the highest level of consumption. Competitive consumption pressures would kind of reduce all along the income spectrum. So this kind of brings us to our end of chapter 8, and thank you for listening.